Before the world had a name, before the first stone was laid, or the first wave broke against a shore that did not yet exist, there was music. Not music as you understand it, not sound carried through air to waiting ears, but something older and more absolute, a great harmonious weaving of thought and will and being, conceived by the One and sung into existence by those he had made to be its voices. They were the Ainur, the Holy Ones, spirits of immeasurable power and beauty, who existed before the world and shaped it with their song.
And among the Ainur there were hierarchies, as there are in all things, greater and lesser, more powerful and less. And among the most gifted of those who served Aulë, the Maker, the Craftsman, the Lord of stone and metal and the deep places of the earth, there was one who stood above the rest. His name was Mairon. It meant the Admirable. And admirable he was, supremely so, with a mind of such precision and comprehension that even among spirits of great age and power he was remarkable. He loved order, he loved craft, he loved the perfect alignment of purpose and execution, the satisfaction of a thing made exactly right, the beauty of a system that worked with no waste and no error.
He served Aulë with complete devotion, and in that service he was without equal. He was the greatest of Aulë's people, and the knowledge that came to him through that service, the deep understanding of how things were made, how they could be unmade, how power moved through material and immaterial alike, was the most comprehensive understanding of craft that any being in the world possessed. This is where it begins, not with malice, not with the desire to burn or to destroy, with precision, with the love of order,
with the particular kind of pride that comes to a supremely capable mind when it begins to believe that its own vision of perfection is the only valid one, that the way it would organize the world, if given the authority to do so, would be better than the way the world is currently organized by those above it. It begins with a gifted mind and a will that outgrew its proper vessel. Melkor found him there.
Melkor was the mightiest of all the Ainur, the one into whom the One had poured the greatest measure of power at the moment of creation, and who had thereafter used that power to reach beyond what was given to him, seeking in the void for the secret fire of creation, for the ability to make things of his own devising, rather than in accordance with anyone else's design. He had failed to find it, but the reaching had changed him, and the change had made him the first and greatest of shadows. He had already begun his long work of marring everything that the Valar made, of introducing discord into every harmony, of spoiling every beauty he could reach. And he looked at Mairon, and he saw what was there, a mind of magnificent precision, a will of extraordinary strength, and in the center of it, the single weakness that would open everything, the belief that order achieved through overwhelming power and singular control was not merely preferable to the messy, collaborative, imperfect process by which the Valar governed, but morally superior to it. The seed of it was not planted by Melkor. It was already there, growing in its own good soil. Melkor simply tended it. The conversations between them, if they could be called that, if the slow seduction of a great spirit can be reduced to something as ordinary as conversation, were not temptations towards cruelty or destruction. Melkor was too intelligent for that.
He did not say, "Come with me and watch things burn." He said, "Look at what is being wasted. Look at the potential of this world being squandered by uncertainty and compromise, and the refusal to impose a singular, coherent will. You could bring order to all of it. You could make it work as it should work. The Valar do not have your gift for this. You do. It is not pride to recognize where power should rest. It is clarity." Mairon listened, and then, at some point that is not precisely recorded, some moment in the long ages before the world was fully shaped, he crossed from listening to believing, and from believing to choosing, and from choosing to going. He went to Melkor. He became Melkor's greatest servant, and in the process of that becoming, he began the long work of making himself into something that Mairon, student of Aulë, lover of craft and order, would not have recognized. He did not lose his gifts. He lost the purpose they had served. In the ancient tongue, his new master gave him names: Gorthaur the Cruel, Sauron the Abhorred. He wore these names the way a blade wears its edge, not as descriptions of his nature, but as descriptions of what he had decided to become, the choices hammered into identity.
But underneath the names, underneath the darkness that accumulated around him, the way soot accumulates on stone near a long fire, the original mind remained. The precision, the organizational genius, the deep understanding of how things were made and how power moved through them. These were still there. They would be the instruments of everything that followed. This is the particular sadness of Sauron, if you are willing to call it that, and you should be, because sadness is the correct response to a great thing going wrong. He was not diminished from the beginning. He was not born small and made evil by his smallness. He was genuinely great, and the greatness was real, and it was entirely spent in the service of ends that made it mean nothing. In the First Age, he was Melkor's lieutenant, the right hand of the first and greatest darkness. He commanded werewolves and vampires, creatures made in mockery of the living things the Valar had conceived. He held the fortress of Tol-in-Gaurhoth, the Isle of Werewolves, that he had taken from the Elves and made into a place of shadow and torment, a tower that stood in the river Sirion, where a tower of light had stood before him, now given over to howling things and darkness and the patient administration of a mind that had turned its gifts entirely toward subjugation. He was a shape changer in this age. This is important, not a minor detail, but a fundamental aspect of what he was. He could wear many forms, move between them with the ease of a great spirit, not yet fully committed to a single shape. He was not fixed. He was not yet the thing he would eventually become, locked into the form his choices made for him. In the First Age, he was still fluid, still capable of appearing as many things: a man of great beauty, a wolf of tremendous size, a serpent, a bat trailing darkness from its wings. The fluidity was power. It was also, in its way, the last freedom he would have, the freedom of a being that had not yet poured itself so completely into a single defining act that its options were permanently narrowed. That freedom ended when he was defeated by a woman and a dog. Luthien Tinuvil, the most beautiful being ever to live in the world,
daughter of the elven king Thingol and of Mairon the Maia, herself a spirit clothed in living form, came to Tol-in-Gaurhoth with the great hound Huan, mightiest of all dogs, servant of the Valar Orome. They came because Beren, the man who loved Luthien, was imprisoned in the tower, and Luthien had refused to accept this, the way the world expects great beauties to accept the losses of the men who love them.
Sauron sent wolves. Huan tore through them as if they were nothing. Sauron sent greater wolves. Huan tore through those too. And then Sauron himself came down, in wolf shape, enormous and terrible, and suffused with the power of his lord, the kind of power that had not been challenged in this fashion, on this ground, in a very long time. Huan caught him by the throat. Sauron shifted, became a serpent, writhing in that terrible grip. Huan did not release him. Became a bat, vast and black, wings beating against the air. Huan did not release him.
And Luthien spoke. She spoke the words that ended the matter, offering to strip Sauron of his raiment of flesh entirely, to leave him as nothing but a formless spirit, unable to take shape again in the world, which was not death, but was worse than death for something that existed through form and will and the ability to act on the world. Sauron yielded the tower. He yielded it completely, yielded his captives, yielded the power of the place, and fled in the form of a vampire, a great bat shape with darkness trailing from it like blood, and he was gone into the wilderness for a time. This was the first and perhaps the most complete defeat he ever suffered.
He had been beaten by two beings, a woman and a hound, through a combination of refusal to accept the limits he relied on, and the specific power of voices that sang in the light of the world rather than against it. And he had been forced to show the thing he most depended on concealing, that his forms were not him, that beneath the wolves and the serpents and the bats there was something that could be threatened, something that did not want to lose its ability to clothe itself in matter and move through the world and act. He returned to Angband. He returned to Melkor's service, and the service continued through the remainder of the First Age, through the long defeats and costly victories, and eventual final confrontation that ended everything. The War of Wrath came at the end of the First Age, like weather that had been building since the beginning. The Valar, who had been reluctant to move against Melkor in the inhabited world, for fear of the destruction their power would cause, at last came in full force. Their host was beyond anything Middle-earth had seen, great and terrible and not to be withstood. Angband was destroyed. Melkor was captured, bound in chains of extraordinary making, and thrust through the door of night into the void beyond the world, where he has remained. His physical form was destroyed. His power was broken. The first darkness was ended. And Sauron, faced with the host of the Valar and the utter collapse of everything he had served, chose. He came before Eönwë, the herald of Manwë the Elder King, and submitted. He appeared to repent. The submission may have had a grain of sincerity in it. The letters of those who preserved this history suggest that the question of what was in Sauron's mind in that moment is genuinely complex, that something in him may have recognized what the defeat of Melkor meant and recoiled from the depth of what he had been part of. But whatever flicker of genuine penitence existed was not strong enough to survive the next requirement.
Eönwë told him that a Maia of his order did not have the authority to absolve him. He would need to return to Valinor and submit to judgment by the Valar themselves, to stand before those powers and accept whatever diminishment or binding they decreed was appropriate for what he had done. Sauron refused.
He could not do it. The pride that had made him susceptible to Melkor in the first place, the conviction that his judgment was superior, that he should not have to submit to the assessment of others, that the humiliation of being judged was an indignity he would not accept, rose in him, and he turned away. He fled. He hid himself in Middle-earth, and in the hiding, whatever remained of the possibility of return was sealed off. The door he had not walked through closed behind him forever. What followed was a period of quiet, not peace, not genuine withdrawal, but the strategic patience of a mind that understood the difference between the time for action and the time for waiting.
The Valar had withdrawn from direct involvement in Middle-earth. The elves who remained were rebuilding. Men were spreading across the recovered lands. The world was in the slow, uncertain process of healing from the First Age's wounds. And Sauron was in the east, watching, gathering himself, and eventually, inevitably, beginning to think again about the thing that was most essential to his nature: order, control, the imposition of a single coherent will on the beautiful, wasteful, agonizingly ungoverned mess that the free peoples made of the world when left to their own devices. He was still beautiful then. This matters because it would not always be true, and the beauty was functional. It was a tool, the fairness of a mind not yet fully committed to a form, the last remaining inheritance of Mairon, who had been admirable before he became something else. He could wear it, he could use it, and he did. He came to the Elves of Eregion around the 12th century of the Second Age, calling himself Annatar, and in the form he chose for the meeting, he was arresting, tall, luminous with apparent wisdom, gracious in speech, his manner carrying the ease of someone entirely comfortable with knowledge and entirely willing to share it. He was beautiful in the way that very competent, very confident people are beautiful, the beauty of a mind that knows exactly what it is doing and does it without apparent effort. He said he came as a teacher. He said his lord was the Valar Aulë, a lie, but a knowing one, an appeal to the heritage of the people he was approaching, a hand extended in the language most likely to be accepted. Galadriel saw through him immediately. Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor, refused his approaches. They were wise enough, or suspicious enough, to see the shape of the deception beneath the beautiful form. But Celebrimbor, the greatest of the elven smiths, the grandson of Fëanor who had made the Silmarils in the elder days, Celebrimbor let him in. For nearly a century, Sauron and the Gwaith y Myrdain worked together. And this is where his genuine gifts become most terrible to contemplate, because the work was real. The knowledge he brought was real. The craft that came from the collaboration was some of the finest work that had ever been done in the world. The rings of power that emerged from Eregion in those years were genuine masterworks, not illusions, not tricks, but actual concentrations of skill and power of the highest order. He was not simply pretending to be a craftsman, he was one. That was the deepest part of the deception, that under Annatar's fair face and generous tutelage there was actual substance, actual craft, actual knowledge that produced real results.
You cannot collaborate with a complete fraud. The elves were too skilled to have been fooled by nothing. What they were fooled by was someone who was genuinely capable of extraordinary things, and was doing those extraordinary things in the service of an intention he had not disclosed. The rings of power were made, 3 for the elves, and Celebrimbor made those himself in the end, without Sauron's direct hand, sensing something and holding those back. 7 for the dwarf lords, 9 for mortal men. And then Sauron left Eregion. He went to Mordor.
He went to the mountain that the world calls Orodruin, the fire mountain, Amon Amarth, the mountain where the earth's own heat comes to the surface in liquid fire, and in the forge that he built within it, in the heat that was the heat of the world's core rather than any manufactured flame, he did the thing that would define the remainder of his existence. He made the One Ring. The making of it was an act of self-mutilation so profound that it should be understood as such.
To make a ring capable of governing all the other rings, capable of reaching through them and through their wearers and exerting his will over them at a distance, he had to pour into it something that could not be replicated. Not merely power, not merely knowledge, but his actual self, his will, his essential being. The core of what Sauron was had to be placed inside the ring for the ring to work, because the ring's function was the extension of him, and for something to be an extension of a self, it must contain that self. He diminished himself to make it.
He accepted a permanent reduction in what he was, a portion of his power and his essential nature now resident in a small circle of gold rather than in him, in exchange for what the ring would give him, the ability to reach into every other ring, to feel through them, to draw their wearers toward him and toward his will, to be everywhere his rings were, even when he was elsewhere. He accepted being less himself in order to have more of everything else. The ring was gold, a plain gold band, apparently simple, unmarked to ordinary eyes. Only in fire did the letters appear, the inscription in the black speech, the language he had devised for his servants, that named its purpose without ambiguity. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. He put it on. The elves felt it immediately. The reach of his will through the rings he had helped make, the pressure of it, the sense of his purpose flowing through the metal and into their minds like water finding the cracks in stone, was unmistakable the moment the One Ring was completed. They tore their rings off. They had understood, in that sudden clarity, what they had been part of. Sauron demanded the rings back. They refused. The war that followed, the war of the Elves and Sauron in the 17th century of the Second Age, was devastating. He broke Eregion. His armies crashed through its defenses with the overwhelming weight of a force held back for too long and finally released. He killed Celebrimbor. This detail deserves to sit alone for a moment. He killed Celebrimbor, the greatest smith the world had seen since Feanor, the man who had trusted him, worked with him for a century, made some of the finest things that had ever been made in the world alongside him. He killed him, and then he used Celebrimbor's body
as a standard, mounted it on a pole, and marched his armies behind it, carrying the dead body of the craftsman as a battle banner, a final act of contempt so complete that it expressed everything about what Sauron had become.
The man who claimed to love craft had murdered its greatest living practitioner and turned his corpse into a war flag. He could not get the locations of the 3 elven rings from Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor told him where the 7 were. He had no choice. The torture that was applied to him was absolute. But the 3 he would not give. He died without speaking them. And Sauron, for all his power and all his precision, could not reach what a dying man had refused to hand him. The 3 were safe, and they would matter in the end. He continued the war. He drove east, he conquered, he established his dominion over great stretches of Middle-earth.
Númenor alone was beyond his reach. The great island kingdom of men who had been given long life and strength beyond ordinary mortality, who sailed to the coasts of Middle-earth in their vast ships, and whose armies were sufficient to make even Sauron's host melt away rather than face them. He expanded Barad-dûr, the dark tower he had begun building in Mordor in the year 1000 of the Second Age, the great edifice of iron and shadow that rose in the corner of the land between the mountains and the Fire Mountain, built to be the seat of his power and the instrument of his watching.
The tower was bound to the ring, as surely as Sauron was bound to it, a physical extension of the same will, the same ordering purpose, the same desire to see and know and control all things. Its height was tremendous, its foundations were the foundations of his power, and it would stand as long as the ring stood. The Númenóreans were his great obstacle. In the 25th century of the Second Age, their last and greatest king, Ar-Pharazôn, a man of immense personal pride and physical courage, and the kind of confidence that comes to those who have never been truly defeated, sailed to Middle-earth with a fleet so large and an army so overwhelming that it simply could not be faced. Sauron's servants fled before it.
The armies that had crushed Eregion and carved dominion across Middle-earth looked at the Númenórean force on the shores of Umbar and dissolved. Sauron chose to be captured. This is the most audacious thing he ever did, and perhaps the clearest demonstration of how his mind worked. The willingness to accept a position of absolute apparent weakness, because the position of apparent weakness was in fact the most powerful position available to him. He could not conquer Númenor with armies. Its distance and strength made direct assault impossible. But he could corrupt it from within. He could do what he did best, enter a system, understand it, and work through it from the inside until the system served him rather than itself.
He allowed himself to be brought as a captive to Númenor. Tall, proud even in chains, dark-haired, his form in this era was still capable of an impression of grandeur, if not of beauty. He was a prisoner who moved like someone who had decided to be a prisoner, rather than been forced into it, and the distinction was visible to those who looked carefully enough. But Ar-Pharazôn was not looking for it. Ar-Pharazôn had won. The greatest enemy in the world had surrendered to him. The king was not suspicious. He was triumphant. Within 3 years, Sauron was the king's chief counselor.
He worked with patience, with a long-game intelligence of a mind that did not tire
and did not hurry, and understood that the deeper the corruption, the longer the process. He praised the king, he listened, he identified the particular fear that governed Ar-Pharazôn's heart. And every man has one, and in a great king it is usually the fear that makes him greatest. Ar-Pharazôn was afraid of death. He was old, and he had conquered everything except time, and the approach of death filled him with a fury that had nowhere to go. Sauron found this and pressed on it gently, consistently over the years. He introduced the worship of Melkor, Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, his own old master, into Númenor.
He built a temple to the shadow on the sacred mountain of Meneltarma, where the people of Númenor had always gone to listen for the voice of the One in silence and reverence. He filled it with fire and with the smoke of burning things. He introduced human sacrifice into the rites, burning the bodies of those selected, sending the smoke up as offerings, reducing the practice of reverence to the practice of obliteration. He told Ar-Pharazôn that the Valar were not gods. He told him they were merely powerful beings who had selfishly claimed dominion over the world and kept the gift of immortality for themselves, hiding it in the undying lands to the west and denying it to men out of fear that men, given enough time, would surpass them. He told him that Ilúvatar himself, the one above all, would not punish a king bold enough to sail west and take immortality by force. He believed none of it. The theology he preached was a set of precision-crafted lies, fitted exactly to the shape of the fear he was exploiting. But he preached it with the confidence of genuine conviction, and the long years of his counsel had done their work, and the king listened.
In the year 3319 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn sailed west. He led the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, so many ships that the sea groaned under them, so many men that the shores of Valinor trembled at their approach. He came to take immortality. He came to make war on the Valar. He planted his standard on the shores of the undying lands and claimed them in the name of Númenor. And Ilúvatar moved. The world was changed in an act so total and so absolute that nothing Sauron had ever planned or conceived could have prepared him for it. The sea rose. The fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed. Not defeated, not driven back, but simply gone, taken into the water before it could become anything.
The undying lands were removed from the circles of the world entirely, placed beyond the reach of any sailing of any mortal ship, accessible only to those with the permission of powers men cannot compel. And Númenor itself, the island, the great kingdom, the civilization of immense beauty and terrible pride that Sauron had so carefully and systematically destroyed, was drowned. The ocean covered it, and it sank, and the sea closed over it, and nothing remained. Sauron's physical body was destroyed in the drowning. He had not been on the ships. He had remained in his tower in Númenor, and the tower and the island and everything on it went into the water.
His spirit, that Maia essence that had been Mairon, that predated the world, fled. It could not be destroyed that simply, that completely, but the body, the form, the beautiful, or at least grand physical shape he had worn through the Second Age, that was gone. It was worse than gone. It was permanently gone. He could still build himself a new body, he was still powerful enough for that, but the ability to choose his form freely, to appear fair, to wear beauty as a tool, was finished. Whatever body he built from that point would be the body his nature now demanded, dark, terrible, immense in physical presence, armored in the material of his own will rather than in any pretense of grace. He could never again appear beautiful.
He could never again be Annatar. The fairest, most potent instrument of his long campaign was gone at the bottom of the sea with Númenor. His spirit returned to Middle-earth. It returned to Mordor, and with a will that was not diminished in its force, even as it was diminished in its options, he built himself a new body and resumed. Stand before what he was now and look carefully, because the form matters. He was enormous, tall beyond the measure of the tallest men, large enough that his physical presence in a space was not merely noticed but felt as a kind of pressure, a reduction of the available air, a shift in the weight of the room. He was armored, not wearing armor, but armored, the black iron of his protection seeming to be part of him rather than something placed on him, fused to his form by the same will that had made the ring. His face, where there was a face, was dark, and the eyes within it were like the eyes of the Nazgûl writ larger, the burning cold light of a will that had long since passed beyond anything that could be called feeling, and had become instead a kind of pure intentionality, purpose stripped of everything that might moderate it. He wore the one ring on his right hand, and the hand itself was large enough that the ring, a bracelet on a man, fit his finger correctly. He wielded a great mace in battle. Not a sword, not a bow, a mace, the weapon of someone who intends to end things rather than to best them, to destroy rather than to defeat, the weapon appropriate to a being whose relationship with opposition had simplified over the centuries to the point where subtlety in violence no longer seemed worth the effort. His voice, when he still chose to use it, when the particular situation called for speech rather than the direct imposition of his will through the ring, was a commanding thing, not beautiful any longer, not the gracious voice of Annatar speaking of craft and possibility. It was the voice of absolute conviction, of certainty so complete that it expressed itself as a physical force, the words arriving not just as sound, but as weight, pressing on the listener with the full authority of a will that had been deciding what was right and enforcing those decisions for longer than any mortal civilization had existed. His presence in the world was detectable before he arrived. Animals fled. The air changed, not with cold, the way the Nazgûl changed it, but with heat. The heat of a vast furnace operating nearby, the heat of a will burning at a temperature that consumed rather than warmed.
Trees near places where his power was concentrated tended to die, not dramatically, not in an instant, but gradually, as if the ground beneath them had been changed into something that could no longer quite support life in the way life required. The Númenórean exiles had built their realms in the east of Middle-earth, Arnor in the north, Gondor in the south,
Elendil the Tall and his sons Isildur and Anarion at their head, the survivors of the wave that had drowned a civilization, carrying with them the last best things of Númenórean civilization, the Palantiri, the great seeing stones, the white tree, grown from the line of trees that stretched back to the Blessed Realm, the memory and the traditions of a people who had been greater than they would ever be again. They built Minas Anor and Minas Ithil at the edges of Mordor, like eyes watching the shadow. Sauron's patience was not infinite. In the year 3429 of the Second Age, he moved against Gondor.
He took Minas Ithil, the city Isildur had built on the border of his land, and burned the white tree that grew there, and drove Isildur onto his ships and into the sea. He besieged Anarion at Osgiliath. He pressed south and west with the full force of what he had gathered in the centuries since his return from Númenor. And then Elendil and Gil-galad formed the last alliance. The alliance between elves and men that gathered at the end of the Second Age was not simply a military coalition. It was the last time these two peoples would fight together in such force, the final great joining of their strength before the Third Age would separate them more and more completely into different fates.
Gil-galad himself came, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, bearer of the spear Aeglos, tall and terrible in his own right. Elendil came, Isildur and Anarion came. The host was immense, gathered from every corner of the free world, marching to the Fire Mountain and the Dark Tower, with the knowledge that this was the decisive confrontation, the one that could not be avoided or delayed. They crossed the Anduin. They drove Sauron's forces back into Mordor. At the field of Dagorlad, the battle plain on the borders of the Black Land, they broke his army. His forces fled or fell. The living things of Mordor retreated into the dead marshes, and the marshes kept them. And in the centuries that followed, the lights in the still water were the lights of those who died at Dagorlad and had never found their way out. Then 7 years of siege, 7 years at the base of Barad-dûr, under the shadow of the Dark Tower, in the ash and the heat, and the grinding endlessness of an assault against a fortress built by the greatest mind in the world to be as impregnable as it could possibly be made. 7 years. The host endured it. They endured it because there was no alternative. Sauron's power was in Mordor, and Mordor would have to be faced, and the siege would have to hold until it was done.
In the year 3441 of the Second Age, Sauron came down. He came down in his full form, armored, immense, the one ring blazing on his hand, the force of him so concentrated in that descent from his tower that the very ground registered it. He waded into the host of the last alliance like a man wading into shallow water. He was not reckless, he never was, but he was overwhelming, and the difference is important. He did not charge in fury. He moved with the terrible calm of something that expected to end this. He killed Gil-galad. The last High King of the Noldor died at his hands. He killed Elendil, the great king of the exiles, the man who had escaped the drowning of Númenor and built new kingdoms in its memory, died with his sword Narsil broken beneath him. Anarion was already dead, killed by a stone hurled from Barad-dûr during the siege. But Isildur was there. Isildur, who was not the greatest warrior among them, not the wisest, not the most powerful. Isildur, who was simply still standing when the others had fallen. He took up the hilt shard of his father's broken sword, Narsil, and with the edge of the broken blade, he cut the one ring from Sauron's hand. The effect was immediate and total.
Without the ring, cut away from the hand that had worn it since its forging, sundered from the will that had created it, Sauron's form collapsed. The body that had been held together by the power, now severed from it, came apart. His spirit was expelled from it, a thing of pure malice with no material form, no face, no voice, no hand to reach or grasp. He was less than the shadow of a shadow. He was a howl of rage in the empty air above a field of dead men. And then he was dispersed. His spirit fled east and east and east, into the unnamed regions of the world, into distance and dark, and for a very long time he was nothing that could act or choose, or be anything at all. Isildur kept the ring.
He should have thrown it into the fire of Orodruin. The mountain was right there. The fire was accessible. The deed could have been done. He chose not to. The ring was already working on him. Its weight in his hand had the quality of its nature, the seductive suggestion that what was too valuable to be destroyed might be useful, that the object of this magnitude should not simply be unmade when it might be wielded, that the decision could be deferred. He took it. He called it his Weregild, his compensation for the deaths of his father and his brother. He walked away from the mountain with the ring, and with that walking away, the unfinished chapter of Sauron's existence resumed, slowly, over the long centuries that followed.
The ring passed to the Gladden fields, where Isildur was ambushed and killed by orcs, and the ring was lost in the river Anduin. And the ring lay there for centuries, waiting. And Sauron's spirit, dispersed and diminished, began the slow, agonizing process of gathering itself back into something that could act. He took shape again, first as a shadow and a whisper, as an influence felt rather than seen. He found Dol Guldur, a hill in the great greenwood that was beginning, very slowly, to darken, and established himself there, concealing his identity, presenting himself not as the Dark Lord returned, but merely as the Necromancer, a dark presence of unspecified nature in a forest that was growing increasingly unwholesome. For centuries he was content with this concealment, not from cowardice, but because his power was not yet sufficient to weather the response his open return would provoke, and the mind that had waited through ages before moving had not lost its patience. He was a shadow in Dol Guldur for 1,000 years of the Third Age. He gathered orcs to him. He sent the Nazgûl, his wraith servants, who had reconstituted themselves as his power reconstituted, on tasks of preparation. He reached into the minds of those who used the seeing stones, the Palantiri, corrupting what he found. He pressed against the free peoples with a pressure they could feel but not precisely locate, a cold unease spreading from the east like weather.
Gandalf suspected him. Gandalf, the Istar, the wizard, the Maia sent to Middle-earth in the form of an old man to help the free peoples resist, came to Dol Guldur to investigate. Sauron fled before him.
His power in those years was enough to maintain his shadow in the forest and his slow corruption of the surrounding lands, but not enough to withstand direct confrontation with the Grey Pilgrim. He withdrew east and waited for Gandalf to leave, and then came back.
In the year 2850 of the Third Age, Gandalf came again, and this time found not only confirmation of Sauron's identity, but the dwarf king Thráin II, son of Thrall, grandson of Thrall, imprisoned in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, in a state that had passed beyond ordinary suffering, into something that barely remembered it had once been a king. Sauron had been holding him for years.
He had stripped from Thráin the last of the 7 dwarf rings, which the dwarves had refused to give up as a people for centuries. The rings that did not make dwarf lords into wraiths, as the 9 had made men into wraiths, but which inflamed their greed until their kingdoms burned with it, and their dragons found them, and their accumulated wealth became the instrument of their ends. Sauron collected these rings one by one, through long patience and various methods, and Thráin's had been the last. For decades after Gandalf's second visit, the White Council, the gathering of the wise, Saruman and Gandalf and Galadriel and the others, debated whether to move against Dol Guldur.
Saruman, the head of the Order, argued against it. The time was not right, the threat not yet critical enough, the action likely to be premature. Gandalf pushed for immediate action. They waited. They waited until 2941 of the Third Age, when they moved at last, and Sauron abandoned Dol Guldur before they arrived. He had been planning to leave anyway. The time for concealment was ending. He was strong enough now to declare himself. He returned to Mordor openly, in the year his servants later called the Year of the Dragon's Death, and the darkness that had been a shadow in a greenwood became the darkness of the Black Land returned in full. Barad-dûr rose again.
It had never been fully destroyed. Its foundations were the foundations of the ring's power, and the ring still existed, and a tower whose foundations are a matter of metaphysics rather than engineering does not simply fall because armies throw themselves against it. What had been cast down was rebuilt with terrible speed, with a will that had been compressing toward this moment for over 2,000 years, a purpose that had been narrowed and sharpened by every century of waiting, until it was as precise and as pitiless as anything in the world. His physical form in this era was not what it had been. This requires honesty. He could not fully reconstitute the towering armoured body of the Second Age while the ring was lost.
The ring held the greater part of his power, and the ring was out of reach, and without it he was present and dangerous, and not to be trifled with, but not fully himself. He existed in Mordor as a vast and terrible will, primarily as the Eye of Sauron. You must understand this image not as a metaphor or a symbol, but as a genuine description of what he had become in the Third Age. A great eye, lidless, wreathed in flame, set within Barad-dûr at a height that could survey all the lands below it. It was his instrument of seeing, the concentrated manifestation of his most essential nature, the watching and the knowing and the directing of power, stripped to its core, because the body that would have housed all of it was not yet available to him. The eye was terrible, in the way that a completely focused will is terrible. It did not blink, it did not look away, it did not forget what it had seen or lose the thread of what it was tracking. It was patient and relentless, and it burned with the particular heat of certainty, the certainty of a being that had decided what it wanted
and had never in all the long ages of the world genuinely accepted that it might not have it. Those who met the Eye in vision or through the Palantiri described it in terms that converge on the same essential experience: a heat, a pressure, a sense of being entirely seen, in the way that you are normally never entirely seen. Every thought, every doubt, every small private fear, available to the scrutiny of something that had no interest in your comfort and no warmth in its regard. To meet the Eye was to be examined by a mind that categorized you immediately and completely in terms of your usefulness or your threat, and then moved on with the efficiency of something that had many such assessments to make, and no patience for the ones that didn't matter. He reached through the Palantiri, the great seeing stones that had been made in Númenor and brought to Middle-earth by Elendil's people, now scattered among the towers and strongholds of Gondor and its allies. He found Saruman through the stone of Orthanc, found him and reached through the stone and pressed his will against the great wizard's pride, his impatience, his desire to be the dominant intelligence in the room, his inability to accept that his own plans might be second best to anyone else's. Saruman fell.
It took time. The corruption of a great mind is not an instant process, but he fell, and his fall removed from the field the person most capable of organizing the free people's resistance, at the moment when resistance was most urgently needed. He learned through Gollum of the ring. He had always known the ring was somewhere in the world. He could feel it distantly, the way you can feel a heartbeat through water, but he did not know precisely where. Gollum, who had carried the ring for 500 years and lost it, and been driven mad by the loss, was captured by Sauron's servants and brought to Barad-dûr. Under questioning, and Sauron's methods of questioning were thorough, Gollum gave him what he needed. The ring was in the Shire, and a hobbit named Baggins had it. He sent the Nazgûl. He sent them in the year 3018, with the urgency of someone who has waited long enough, longer than any mortal endurance could have sustained, and is done waiting. The 9 ring-wraiths, his greatest servants, riding black horses through a world that flinched at their passing, bound for a small and peaceful country in the northwest of the world, where a creature of no political consequence had by accident and by inheritance come to possess the most important object in the history of the world. The months that followed were the closest he had ever come to having everything he had ever wanted, and they were the months in which everything came apart. He could see the movements of armies and powers across the land. He could feel the ring, feel it getting closer to the fire as the small company that carried it moved through Rohan and into Mordor itself, feel it with a growing, terrible clarity as it got closer to Orodruin. He launched his war on all fronts simultaneously, an assault of the kind that only a mind capable of holding entire campaigns in parallel could organize. Gondor besieged, Rohan attacked, Dale struck in the north, Lorien assaulted across the Anduin.
Every free people facing pressure at the same moment, their attention everywhere at once, their resources split. No single front able to receive the reinforcement it needed, because every front was a crisis simultaneously. It was brilliant.
It was the fullest expression of the organizational genius that had always been the best thing about him, the capacity to see the whole board, to move pieces on every part of it in coordination, to ensure that no enemy could rest or regroup or find breathing room. It very nearly worked. The Witch King broke the gate of Minas Tirith, the Great Gate, the impregnable door of the White City, shattered not by force of arms, but by the force of concentrated will applied with perfect precision.
The Pelennor fields ran with blood. The armies of Mordor had numbers that made the defenders' courage look almost beside the point. Sauron watched all of it through the eye, and the eye was calm in the way that certainty is calm, in the way that something which has already calculated the outcome and found it favorable does not need to be agitated about the process. And then, on the 25th of March, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, Frodo Baggins stood at the edge of the crack of doom. Sauron felt it. He felt the ring above the fire.
He felt his own essential self, the portion of his being that he had poured into the gold and fire of that small band on the day he had made it. He felt it poised above the destruction that would unmake it. And for the first time in the history of his vast and terrible consciousness, the thing he felt was something like what lesser beings would call fear. He turned the eye toward Mordor. He turned it from the battles, from the Pelennor, from the gate, from all of it. He turned it toward the mountain, toward the small pair of figures on its slopes, who should have been completely beneath his notice, and were instead the only thing in the world that mattered. He saw what was happening. He reached with everything the ring allowed him to reach with, the full, terrible extension of his will, trying to grip the ring through the distance and the rock and the fire, trying to draw it back, to prevent, to stop, to undo. Gollum bit the ring from Frodo's finger. Gollum fell into the fire with it, and the ring fell with him, and the fire took it. And Sauron was gone. Not defeated, not scattered as he had been after the War of the Last Alliance, diminished but capable of eventual return. Gone, in the specific, complete, permanent way that things made of given essence are gone when the vessel of that essence is destroyed. He had poured himself into the ring. The ring was unmade.
The portion of himself that he had made the ring with, his will, his essential power, the core of what Mairon had been before Mairon became Sauron, was gone with it, dissolved in the fire where it had been created, returned to nothing, from which nothing returns. His spirit was dispersed so completely, so utterly, so finally, that it could never again take form. Not in this age, not in any age, not even the thin and shadowed reconstitution he had managed after the War of the Last Alliance was available to him now. There was not enough left of him to constitute anything. He became less than a thought of darkness. He became less than the memory of a shadow.
He became nothing, which is what he had been making himself into since the moment he chose not to walk through the door that Eönwë had opened and had turned away from it into the dark. Barad-dûr fell. The foundations that had been laid in the ring's power lost their anchor, and the tower came down. came down in a collapse so total that the plain of Mordor shook and the mountains around it answered. The Nazgûl, his wraith servants, shrieked once in the air above the fire mountain and were gone, dissolved with the source of their persistence. The armies of Mordor, abruptly emptied of the will that had organized and driven them, fell apart. Scattered, leaderless, purposeless, running into the hills and the wastes.
The fires of Orodruin, which had burned for the ring's sake, did what fires do when their purpose is removed. They erupted, and the mountain raged, and the sky over Mordor became an inferno of ash and ruin. And somewhere in all of that was the last of the One Ring and the last of Sauron, turning to smoke and then to nothing together. The Third Age was over. What remained after the smoke cleared and the armies went home, and the long work of rebuilding the world that had lived in his shadow began? What remained was the shape of his absence. Mordor, empty now, in a particular way that empty countries are not usually empty. Not merely uninhabited, but drained, the land bearing the marks of what had organized it for so many centuries.
The dead marshes where the faces still looked up through the still water. The plains of Dagorlad where the grass had never quite recovered. Minas Morgul, the city that had been Minas Ithil, pale and cold and wrong, even after its fall. And farther, in the green wood that had been Mirkwood, and was now brightening again towards its old name of Erin Lascallan, in the corridors of Dol Guldur, where the White Lady came in the days after the ring's fall, and threw down the walls, and broke the dungeons, and cleaned what could be cleaned of what had been done there. In all of these places, the mark of him. He had been the greatest of Aulë's servants.
He had been Mairon, the Admirable, a mind of extraordinary precision, and a will of extraordinary strength, and a gift for craft that was genuinely without equal in the world. He had looked at the way the world was organized and found it wanting, and the wanting had been the beginning, and the beginning had led to everything. He had wanted order. He had wanted it with such force and such absolute certainty that his vision of order was the correct one, that he had converted the wanting into the single organizing principle of an existence that stretched from before the world's making to the last moment of the Third Age.
He had made the ring as the instrument of his order, had poured himself into it as the ultimate act of commitment to a vision that would not accept compromise or collaboration, or the messy, imperfect, uncreated possibility of free beings choosing for themselves. In the end, a creature he had never considered worth considering, a hobbit of the Shire, small, frightened, failing, who had been the least likely carrier of the most important object in the world, had carried it to the place where it had to go. Not through strength, not through the organizational genius that Sauron himself brought to every problem he faced. Through something that Sauron, in all his long life and all his extraordinary mind, had never found a way to account for. The willingness to continue when continuation seemed impossible. The stubborn, entirely irrational refusal to stop. The one thing his vision of order had no place for. The one thing his model of the world, for all its complexity and all its power, could not predict.
He is gone from the world. The name remains in old songs, in the histories that the elves carried west with them when the Third Age ended and the time of elves in Middle-earth was over. In the traditions of the Dúnedain, who kept the memory of what had cost them so much to defeat.
But the presence is gone, completely and permanently, and the world that exists without it is quieter, in the particular way that a world is quieter when the thing that had been pressing on it from every direction for 3,000 years is no longer there to press. He had been admirable, and then he had been something else, and then he had been nothing. The admirable does not always endure. What we put ourselves into endures for a time, and when it is gone, we are gone with it, as completely as if we had never been anything at all.